Hi everybody, and welcome back to an Invisible and Invisible Illness Awareness project. I've been talking about mast cell disorders for the past few weeks. Now I'd like to move on to histamine intolerance, or maybe even take a step back, because when you first realize something is wrong and you're looking to figure out what it is, you're gonna come across histamine intolerance most likely before mast cell disorders, which is the way it happened for me. I think the term histamine intolerance is more commonly known among lay people. I was familiar with that for quite a while before I even heard of mast cells. One possible cause of histamine intolerance can be a mast cell disorder, so it's really just sort of like a subset of people with histamine intolerance who have mast cell disorders. There of course are people with histamine intolerance that's being caused by something else. The thing about histamine intolerance, you can find a lot of information about it online, and it's like every website has a different list of which foods you should avoid and which you shouldn't, but you're a lot less likely to hear about it from your doctor. With mast cell disorders, most doctors haven't heard of them, but you can find specialists. They're rare, they're hard to get to, but they exist. With histamine intolerance, there are specialists. The only one I can name is Dr. Janice Jojoba, who is in Vancouver, I believe. Similar to mast cell disorders, the whole process of how histamine intolerance works is also a bit complex, but here it is. So, you have 4 histamine receptors in your body. H1 is in your sinuses, which would be if you're sneezing, runny nose, that sort of thing. H2 is in your gut, so that would be if you have upset stomach, bloating, constipation. H3 is in your bones, which is probably connected to mast cell patients having bone pain. And H4 is a neuroreceptor, which would cause symptoms like anxiety. And it's interesting because you have first-generation antihistamines, which not only target a certain receptor, like H1 or H2, depending on your symptoms, but they can also cross through the blood-brain barrier and make you drowsy, which people know from medications like Benadryl, for example. At the point where I started eliminating foods and I was very sensitive to everything, I tried taking some antihistamines and they made me very anxious. Even though they were second gen, they managed to cross over. If you're blocking your H1 receptors, that means that the histamine has already been released into your body. It just can't enter the receptors where it's supposed to enter to create those symptoms. So you don't get the symptoms, but that histamine is still floating around freely in your body, and that doesn't seem like a good solution either. So what you can do, alternatively, is to take mast cell stabilizers. So there again is the connection between mast cell disorders and histamine intolerance. If you take mast cell stabilizers, you stop the histamine from being released in the first place, and then it's not floating around, and then you're less likely to need histamine blockers. The other thing is that your body not only produces histamine in response to allergens, it also is a byproduct of the digestion process, which means that if you're eating something that is more difficult for your body to digest, your body's going to produce more histamine in order to digest it. You have a certain amount of dietary histamine in your food and being produced by your body to digest the food, and then you have this enzyme called diamine oxidase, which is DAO for short, and that's the enzyme that breaks down the histamine. And as long as they're the same, you have enough DAO to break down the amount of histamine you have, there's not a problem. But if you're eating foods that are high in histamine and you don't have enough DAO, then you have this leftover histamine. Or if you're eating foods that are blocking the DAO production, then you're, again, not going to have enough to break down all that histamine. There's also foods that don't contain histamine themselves, but they encourage your body to release more histamine. There also could be the genetic aspect of why your body is producing less DAO or more histamine. And then, as if all of that is not complicated enough, histamine is also naturally in everything you eat because it's a part of the decomposition process. So you can never avoid it entirely, and even if you have foods that are low in histamine, if they're left sitting out for a while, the level of histamine in them will increase. So typically when you find out you have histamine intolerance, what you do is dramatically change your diet. You have to eliminate the high histamine foods. You can focus on foods that are good for DAO. You want to avoid foods that are going to block your DAO. You can also supplement DAO, but that gets expensive and it doesn't always work, and you have to take it before you eat. A lot of times that involves giving up alcohol. And then once you've reached a low histamine diet and you're still having problems, what people end up having to do, going more towards the extreme, is to buy their food frozen, cook it in a pressure cooker so that you don't waste any time defrosting it or anything. You eat it, freeze all of the leftovers, and only defrost them right before you want to eat, so that there's the absolute minimum amount of time where that food can be producing histamine. And you also have to avoid stuff like ground meat because all of the little cuts allow it to decompose faster, which means it's producing more histamine. And then of course you have people who are taking several different types of antihistamines targeting different receptors all day, every day, and still react. Yeah, but personally from my experience, I mentioned it to my doctor. He looked into it and said that the blood tests for histamine are not very reliable because they change so constantly. You know, it could depend on the type of day you're having. It could vary a lot. It could depend on the time of day, or, you know, so many factors. He didn't really see the point in testing. And then I was at the gastroenterologist for other reasons, and I mentioned this, and they said, well, we can test it, but we want you to eat low histamine for 3 weeks, and then we'll test to see how your histamine and DAO levels are. I just recently discussed this with somebody who was saying that you actually are supposed to eat high histamine right before you have it tested, because if you're eating low histamine, then the test is kind of pointless, which actually makes a lot of sense because the test results came back showing everything was normal, and they're like, okay, so you don't have this. But I did notice during those few weeks where I was eating low histamine, it was really difficult because I was craving a lot of things, but I did notice an improvement, that my energy temporarily got a bit better, and that's kind of how things went as I was cutting foods out of my diet in general, that it would get better for a short period, and then it would kind of fade out and go back to the way it was before. I've always been a night person, but in addition to staying up late, I also would always wake up in the middle of the night, and when I went low histamine, I stopped waking up in the middle of the night, and I would sleep all the way through. A little bit later down the line, once I had adjusted to being low histamine, if I did eat anything that was high in histamine, I definitely noticed the effect. In my case, it just really intensified that feeling of fatigue. For example, I tried eating eggs, and now I can't remember if it was the yolk or the white, but one part of the egg is supposed to be okay and the other part isn't. So I separated it, ate only that part, and it was like a few minutes later, I could barely keep my eyes open. Like, my eyes were really just falling shut. Then with other things, like with meat that was high in histamine, I wouldn't notice anything right away. But what would happen is I would go to bed, and then I would wake up a lot earlier than I normally would and just be feeling really energetic. Like, you know, I'm ready to get up and go, but I'm like, you know, it's still nighttime, I need to go back to sleep, you know, why am I up this early? And eventually I would go back to sleep, but then when I would wake up again, I would just feel so heavy and foggy, and just like I couldn't get up and go anywhere or do anything or think anything, and just stuck in bed. And then as part of the elimination, to see if my symptoms improved, I started buying all of my meat frozen. And several months after that, I ate something that was just like fresh meat and ended up getting diarrhea from it. The one thing that I had really bad at the time was this pain in my wrist that had been going on for quite a while, and they couldn't find anything wrong with it. I've been to so many specialists, and the only way I could really deal with it was I had this brace that I was wearing, and I would put it so tight that it would cut off the circulation, and then when my head went numb, the pain would stop. But when I went low histamine, it stopped permanently. At the time, I was really hoping that I could just cut out a few foods and figure out what the main triggers are and then go back to eating normally. Unfortunately, that wasn't really possible, but I'm also lucky that I'm no longer as limited as I used to be. So now, for example, I will eat fresh meat again, but I just look at the date and make sure that it's the farthest date from the current date and not pre-seasoned. I still don't really eat any ground meat, and typically I eat it within a day of buying it or I freeze it. So yeah, I'm fortunate that I'm no longer as limited as I was, but it can get a bit tricky, especially if you live someplace where the options for frozen food are not that many. Yeah, that's basically my experience with histamine intolerance. If you deal with histamine intolerance yourself, of course, feel free to comment and let me know if your experience was somewhat similar or different to mine. If you had any experience with doctors and how they handle it in different places, really be interested to know. So yeah, leave me a comment and I will see you guys next week. Bye.